Material science and arts. As a PhD student, I have to use material science and material analysis technique for the study of my experiments and my samples. I do X-ray diffraction as well as microscopy for my samples to study chemical reactions, chemical phases, but also mechanical damage. Those techniques are based on physics, chemistry, engineering. So I was quite surprised when my friend, Helen, told me that she was using similar techniques for her PhD in arts. So today we welcome her, really happy to listen how she uses those techniques, how arts actually sometimes needs material science, and we'll welcome her. Hello.
Hello. I'm very glad to be here.
I'm really happy you're here. So humble colleague, but also a PhD now. So now you're a second year PhD student at the University of Cambridge too in arts. Mm-hmm. Can you tell me what's your thesis about?
Yeah, so my thesis is on tempera in surrealist art, and tempera is a paint binder. So most people would be familiar with oil paint. That's what most people use today. If you've ever painted, that's probably what you bought in the shop. But before oil paint became popular around the 15th century, painters used to bind their pigments with egg, for example, or with glue. And these are different kinds of tempera. So I'm looking how artists in the 20th century revived these old techniques. And I'm also looking at the kind of pigments they would have used in conjunction with that paint binder.
Non-vegan friendly, huh?
Yeah, exactly.
Do you use the yellow or the egg or both?
There's different techniques. Yeah, mostly the egg yolk, because that's, if you've ever baked as well, that's kind of what holds together a cake, right? If you bake, it's a good binding agent. Yeah, and then lots of animal glues, fish glue, rabbit glues, these kind of things. Yeah.
What do you attempt to do with this? Like, does it bring an understanding of how people used to paint, or how does it help understanding art?
Yeah, that's a very good question, because identifying what they used is only the first step in my research. Yeah, I'm very interested in the why. Basically, tempera is in some aspects more difficult to use than oil, and it was kind of a lost skill as well. So only in the 19th century they found old recipes, they started translating them, and painters started experimenting and learning these kind of craft skills again, because that was also the time that paints became industrialized and you could just buy ready-made paints in tubes and you had no idea what was inside, and some painters were unhappy because materials behave differently, like you say, in different environments, and they had no control really over what was in there, so they couldn't really control how the materials would work together, and the quality, how long the work would last. So I'm interested in the kind of ideologies also behind reviving these techniques.
Yeah. So how does it differ from oil painting? Is it does it solidify quicker, or is it the brush that you have to put more pressure? I mean, I don't know about art, so you have to go.
No, it's a very good question. Yeah, exactly. In oil paint, especially if you layer very thin glazes, you have to wait sometimes months for one layer to dry, depending on how much oil you use. So it's a very, very slow process. And tempera dries a lot quicker, so you layer more quickly, but at the same time, because of the way the paint behaves, it you cannot push it very fast, so you have to do tiny, tiny, tiny brush strokes. So it's a very tedious kind of way of painting.
But it's not pointillism, right? It has nothing to do with this. Okay. But they could use it for pointillism?
Probably you could, yeah. Okay. It's more if you ever been to a museum in the kind of 14th century kind of paintings of Madonnas with child, and you see these, you see the brush strokes, and you see that colours aren't blended, but kind of painted next to each other, on top of each other. That's probably, that's an indication that tempera might have been used. Yeah. So
what material science techniques do you use then to make sure that it's tempera, as you said?
Yeah, so for tempera, because it's organic, we use different techniques to identify organic components like the ramen or the FDIR. And then if we look at, this is the expert, I have to be careful what I say.
No, go ahead. I'm listening.
But yeah, if we look at pigments, I think then it's probably that we use, because those are the inorganic kind of mineral-based pigments that we would use, probably techniques that you use as well, like the SEM, EDS.
So SEM is a scanning electron microscope. So it's an electron microscope that we also use. And what you do is you have an electron beam that covers the material and just scans it line by line, and it gives you basically what kind of element you have, but also topographically how it looks like, more or less. So you can see any damage, but also what kind of elements you have present.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's in art, what's the challenging aspect is that you have to take the material from the painting, right? I don't know how it works. Where do you get your samples from?
So I have metallic samples, and basically what I do is I polish the cross section, and then I just place them like right away. So I'm not doing like a transmission electron microscope where you would see through the material, you just see the surface of it. Yeah.
But then if you want to do this with a sample from a painting, you have to very carefully kind of take a sample out of it. And of course a lot of owners of paintings aren't always, it's a common practice, and it doesn't do a big damage to a painting, and usually there's very ethical ways. There's a whole protocol of how you sample, of course, but once you have the sample, you cut a cross section and put that into resin, and then you can use that.
Do you take the border of the painting, or like do you go in the middle of the Mona Lisa and take her nose? Like,
exactly. I feel like especially the Jesus figure is usually off limits. But no, it depends on your research questions as well.
Okay.
If you want to see in a particular part of the painting how it is layered, for example, you have to sample there, right? But if we look at binder analysis, usually this is also, you kind of assume that the same binding media might have been used across the whole surface. So if you don't want to interfere with the paint surface that is visible to the audience, for example, you can try and sample at the edges. Yeah.
I think we're going to display some images of both material science pure stuff and what you do. It'd be really cool to have a comparison. Sometimes I see arts in my pictures, I see little birds, and we like to exchange photos. But obviously yours is the opposite. It's like material science on art, you know. I wanted to know, did you use these techniques in your undergrad studies? Like, did you learn them before? It's just for your PhD?
So no, at undergrad, so I did history of art, history and English literature at undergrad. Most history of art programs are more image-based, but I did a master's program at Stockholm University, so there's more and more postgrad programs in technical art history, so that's the field. It sits somewhere between art history and conservation science, and tries to combine art historical questions with kind of the methods of conservation or material science to answer questions. Yeah. Was
it daunting, like, to think, I'm gonna have to do science? Like, possibly you go in arts not necessarily liking science or not knowing much. Is it like, oh my god, I have to do
this? It was very daunting. It was also very funny, I think, at Stockholm University. It was the proper physics and chemistry professors, quite senior people, who gave us the introduction to chemistry, basically crash course like chemistry in 5 weeks.
Oh my god.
And it was challenging because they not only taught us how to use the instruments, which I think if you've done it, it's straightforward, it's the process. I mean, the interpretation of results can be difficult, but they also wanted us to understand how these instruments work, and that was the challenging part, really understanding.
Yeah, and sometimes you don't think it's necessary, and you're like, why do I have to learn how to manipulate it? But actually it gives you ownership on the machine, and on your work later on, because nothing more frustrating when you try to do a microscopy image and then you just don't manage to find your sample in the machine. And if you understood better how it worked, then you find it. But still, it is very brave. And do you think you're going to use those techniques later on in your career, or is it just for your PhD?
I hope so. Okay. Yeah, it's a very funding and kind of access intense kind of research in comparison to a lot of art history. But what I like about it is the collaborative aspect. So often these projects, because then you need such different sets of skills, you would work with a chemist maybe, or like a scientist, a conservation scientist, an art historian, maybe a curator from the museum, and people come together to answer certain research questions. While I feel I don't know how you feel about your PhD research, but I feel it's often you work alone for a very long period of time, very intensely.
Yeah, it's true, but I kind of like that too. No, it really depends. Sometimes it really depends on your subject. For me, it's a lot of working alone, but I still enjoy it. And material science in itself is very interdisciplinary, so you have to be this kind of toolbox, whereas other are less interdisciplinary, and that's why you need other people to help you. So what's your dream job then?
Oh, I don't know. I went to work in a museum as a curator, and I think you could bring this kind of research in that you have a big collection if you work for a museum that, for example, has a collection, and to do this kind of research, to learn more about works in the collection would be very interesting.
Amazing.
So,
And what have you learned so far from your PhD? Like anything that was really intriguing so far in your research?
Yeah, I think we
Bit
talked
early,
about...
but-
No. I mean, what I'm very interested in is, I think we talked about this idea of alchemy. So the artists I'm looking at, they were not only interested in reviving these old painting techniques, but they were also very interested in these old knowledge systems like alchemy and the relationship, for example, between the planets and the metals that are in the pigments.
Yeah.
So that's really interesting. So you can use the material science and analysis techniques to kind of identify what pigments an artist might have used in a specific work, and then often through the iconography of the image, if it's very related to kind of cosmology and you see it has these occult references, you can kind of infer where they're thinking about when they were using copper-based pigments, where they're trying to invoke this presence of the planet Venus, for example. Or the pigment vermilion is very interesting. It's a red pigment, mercury sulfide, and mercury and sulfur are the two elements, philosophical elements of the process of alchemy that the philosopher's stone is made from.
Oh wow, I didn't know that.
So that's
supposedly made of.
Yeah.
I don't know. Maybe I've read Harry Potter many times. I still don't know what's in it.
Yeah. But so this is it's very interesting if artists are using this pigment, I think, because it has such a strong kind of meaning, or you can infer so much meaning from that. So that's what I love, starting with kind of the analysis and then kind of going on from there into different directions.
So you do like statistics, like 20% of mercury sulfide. That guy was really that much for that planet, and he was an alchemist, definitely. This one a bit more red. I think that's probably Mars, right? No, it's quite interesting. And I was actually thinking, I was looking into, you know, different planets, their colours and what they associated with, and sometimes the colours that they actually are, it's not necessarily what they're referred to in, for example, astrology or in other references. But I was actually thinking, what if you painted in a certain colour with one agent, and that agent actually can be poisonous, like for example lead, you know, it's poisonous, mercury is also poisonous, you know. So imagine if you, for example, you're painting for Mars normally we would think, you know, iron oxide, normally, but if you were to start painting, you think, well, I'm becoming more aggressive, and it's actually because of the thing that you're using that paint.
No, I think it is, and some even in the 20th century, some artists really believed in magic, right, or ideas of magic, and how if you used an iron oxide pigment, you were like using the power of the planet Mars, like through the correspondence between the pigment and the planets, and you could kind of empower yourself, for example, or channel it into the work.
So you could paint your power into it.
Exactly.
So you have to do lots of history in your PhD too, or how does that work?
Yeah, it's a combination really of lots of different lots of different things.
So tell me, is the material science the favourite part of your PhD?
I think it is. It might be a bit the novelty. No, but I think it's very interesting to kind of do something different, and I think the future of research, if you want to say so, is more like interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary, and thinking about how different disciplines contribute right knowledge to different projects. So I think that's why I wouldn't want to just do kind of very straight art history. I would want to bring in something.
Everything. Can you walk us through preparation of one sample, either microscopy, gas chromatography, FTR? What can you walk through us one of them when you haven't done it yet?
I haven't done any analysis yet for that project because the access has been
limited, but you're soon getting it right.
I hope to be able to do some of it. During the master's program we did a lot. We practiced sampling on kind of a mock-up in order not to destroy any paintings. We mostly destroyed our fingers, to be honest, because you use a very sharp scalpel, and if you hold it at the long bit, you don't have a lot of control over it because the blade is so wobbly. So you hold the blade basically, and you're so careful not to damage the painting because it's not like cutting into butter, right? It's like a hard, chippy surface. So if you put too much pressure, it just kind of, you get a very large, like it just cracks. So you have to be very, very careful, and you're so concentrated on the cutting process that you're not realizing that you're squeezing your fingers really hard against the blade. But you cut a tiny sample, so ideally it's like maybe 1 millimeter by 1 millimeter. So they're quite small, and then you very carefully collect it. and then you put it in the resin.
Mhm.
Help me, it's resin, right?
Yeah.
And then you cut it with a big saw.
Yeah.
You just have to be careful if you want to do a cross section. You have to
Mhm.
check that you cut it the right way. Right? You don't want to cut it like this. You want to cut it like
It's like
exactly, just the sample destroyed, and then you polish.
Mhm.
So you have to heavily polish that surface to make sure that no resin's on top of the sample, right?
Mhm.
Otherwise, it interferes.
Mhm.
Especially if you're looking at organic
Mhm.
components, then you just get the response from that. And then you have the sample ready. And the nice thing about
You have to coat it first, no?
do we cut?
Normally it's not conductive, right? Because it's organic. So to have a conductive element in electron microscopy, basically because you have electrons that are negatively charged, if you have a surface like plastic or stuff like this, it doesn't conduct the electrons away, so they will start charging. And what's really funny is that you see an effect like you can see the inside of your microscope. Like basically your electron is just completely reflected, and you see the inside of your machine instead of your sample.
And
so
then you know you've done something wrong.
yeah, exactly. So you have to coat them normally with, for example, carbon, or you can go them with like platinum, palladium, gold, and stuff like this. And you just like make a whole coating on it, and then it normally works quite well. So I guess you have to do that at some point.
I think.
Depending on what pigment you have, maybe you have metallic pigments that are sufficient for the conduction. Right?
Yeah, exactly. And the nice thing is most, like the SEM, EDS, and also the FDR, the ramen, they're non-destructive, right? So if you, like, there are samples that we're taking from paintings like 100 years ago, maybe, or like at least 50 years ago, so you can reuse them in some sense, because also these kind of technologies, I mean, they evolve very, very quickly, right?
Yes, I mean, it gets more and more precise. Like, I guess, like, microscopy from 20 years ago are not as performant as now, but the like, how you say, technology itself is quite implemented since 50 years, right?
Yeah. So I mean, there's always a bit of the hope if you take a sample now, you could maybe at a later stage you will get more information from it.
Exactly, because more precise.
Things have evolved. Yeah, and that's then you have the sample really. But we also sometimes analyze just loose pigments. So if you just have a jar, for example, artists. Estates sometimes have like materials that were in the artist's studio that have survived. Sometimes you just get a pigment sample, really like a loose, like pure pigment from a jar that you analyze.
It must feel like a treasure, like look, I found a jar.
The problem is you never know, did they use it, when did they use it, it's like this, you
can't really date them to, oh man. It must be really, really interesting. Well, I think that's all for us. Is there anything you wanted to add, any fun fact? Or
would you consider working on a cultural heritage project? Would that be something you were interested in your field? Do you think it's too different?
I don't think it's too different. It's just I love so many things, and I love aerospace. So I really like that part of material sciences, the applied part, and the material analysis is just a way to get to that, right? So I do enjoy working in the lab, but I don't know if it was an artistic application how much I'd be able to put in it, because then I would have to also do the history, and I don't have the background behind it. I'd be like, he painted blue because he liked blue. Basically, that's it, right? I think I would have to change fields quite a lot. Like, I could be a technician, but to get the whole picture like you get would be a long way for me.
It's a specialization.
But maybe one day you give me a phone call and be like, that was on a plane.
I would help. I only see the inside of them. What did I do?
Exactly. Well, thank you so much. I hope that you enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for joining me today.
For inviting me.
No problem. And if you have any questions for Helen, just shoot her questions. It'll be fine. Take care, everyone.